Welcome to the Wellness Rebel Show, where you reclaim your health and tap into your body's healing power. I'm your host, Fatima, here to empower you with the knowledge and tools to take charge of your well-being. Whether you want to boost energy, improve mindset, or unlock vitality, this is your go-to source for practical advice and inspiration. It's time to step into your power and live a life of health and freedom. Welcome to the revolution. Welcome back to the Wellness Rebel Show. Today, I have Deidre with me, best-selling author of Toxic Infertility and founder of Always Growing. Welcome, Deidre.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. So why don't you start and tell us about your journey, why you decide to go this route, and all the things.
Yeah, so me and my team specialize in reversing infertility with couples through the lens of addressing toxicity. And kind of how we started here was I have a little boy who's almost 4. And when he was born, I realized I wanted to help women have this, right? Having children is amazing, and becoming a mom is truly transformational. And so I wanted to specialize in fertility. But when my little boy was almost a year old, he started getting very severe eczema. And I figured out over the course of doing testing on both him and myself that he had actually accumulated a lot of the toxin burden that I had and had passed in utero to him. And so I started exploring how this was also impacting women and couples who are trying to conceive. And I found that there were some huge connections when it comes to toxicity in our bodies, and that it's impairing the ability to conceive in a lot of different ways. So that's where we really specialize. And we really believe that when you remove toxicity from the body and nourish what has been damaged as a result, miracles are basically possible.
Yeah. And that's really great because I know now, like lately, it's been getting kind of more of a spotlight, right? Like that toxicity is one of the reasons why couples are having a harder time getting pregnant, or why there's recurrent miscarriages and all that stuff. And also like passing on our toxic burden to our children. Now, would you recommend, I know detox is also a big word, kind of like doing this, right? Like if, let's say someone was already pregnant and they wanted to lower their toxic burden while they're pregnant, do you recommend doing something like that?
Yeah, so it gets really tricky because I do believe that detoxification is best done in the preconception period or after pregnancy and breastfeeding. So,
Okay.
because there is a baby in utero and we just don't have a lot of information about how that burden is transferred, we know that a lot of toxins can cross the placental barrier.
Mhm.
So, we never recommend doing deep detoxification work during pregnancy or breastfeeding. However, I think there's so much that you can do. And as you said, detox is this big term that I think we often think about, like doing a protocol that is removing toxins from the body. But ultimately, the thing to keep in mind is that if you have a toxin burden, supporting liver function, supporting kidney function, staying hydrated, making sure that you are having daily bowel movements, all of those things are actually going to help with detoxification as a whole. And they're often the places that people are missing, and they're a great first step. So while you're not pushing detoxification during pregnancy or breastfeeding, you can certainly decrease your toxin burden during those seasons of life. And that just means that both mom and baby are going to be safe, and that there's not going to be any adverse outcomes.
Yeah. What happens to a woman? No, not to a woman, to a woman during pregnancy or birth that, you know how like the first time they're like, oh, I got pregnant so easily the first time, I won't have a problem the next time. And then all of a sudden they're finding out that they're like, why is it harder to get pregnant? And then another, like, I'm just going to continue my question real quick. Like the second part is like, now also a lot of people think that it's normal for that to happen. It's like, it might be common, but it's definitely not normal. So what happens, or what make like causes that secondary infertility?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is becoming more of an issue. I know as a mom, I have a lot of friends who are now experiencing secondary infertility, and there's not a lot of the same resources for those women. So, during pregnancy and birth, and especially if you are breastfeeding, we're giving everything to our babies. So, I often say we build babies from scratch. They come
Yeah.
from nothing. and we're using things like prenatal vitamins, but prenatal vitamins are really for mom. So if you aren't using a prenatal vitamin or your prenatal vitamin is not adequate in some capacity, it doesn't mean that your baby's going to suffer necessarily. It means that your body is going to utilize the resources in you that it has and deplete you. And so when we're forming things like bones in particular for a whole new human, we lose a lot of minerals in particular. And so what happens is we are transferring pounds of minerals to our children over the course of pregnancy and birth alone. Take also into account that many women do breastfeed for some period of time. So if they're breastfeeding for 3 months, 6 months, whether that's up to 3 years, whatever that looks like, there's going to be varying degrees of nutrient and mineral depletion that happens. And one of the things that we know happens with minerals is they displace and make safety in our body. So they have a lot of purposes, but they also help keep things in check. And one of the things that important minerals like calcium and magnesium, sodium, potassium do is they kind of crowd out things like heavy metals. And so somebody maybe who has a heavy metal burden that isn't really causing any issues, they don't have any symptoms, they don't have any issues conceiving the first time, but now they've gone through pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, and depleted their mineral levels. So, sometimes these women have things like postpartum anxiety or depression. That's kind of a clue from my perspective that clinically they might be deficient in some minerals. Once that happens, those heavy metals now can start to cause issues and they further displace those important macro minerals. When that happens, that's going to impair the ability to conceive. And research shows that heavy metal burden on the body changes the way that the liver functions. It changes the thyroid, so it can contribute to things like hypothyroidism postpartum. It can change the way that the brain functions, thinking about the way that the pituitary responds and communicates with all endocrine glands in the body, so that can impair ovulation. It can also create a cell danger response in every cell in the body. And so ultimately, those heavy metals that were maybe there before for the first pregnancy but weren't causing issues now get to cause a whole lot of damage and make it very difficult to conceive. So that's one of the big things that we often find when we do this type of toxin testing with women who have secondary infertility is that they have a heavy metal burden that maybe has been there for years and years and never caused any issues, but now they need to do some detoxification work or at least determine exposure sources for those.
Yeah. And then would replenishing and rebalancing the minerals, would that essentially also help to move out the heavy metals out of the body?
Yep, absolutely. It's one of the big things that we focus on is we have to bring those minerals in that are deficient based on their unique presentations to help crowd out those heavy metals, as well as using things like binders to pull those metals out of the body as well. So it is, like you said, it's kind of like bookends. We want to bring in the macro minerals to help support those, but we also want to remove those heavy metals that are causing issues so that we're kind of moving the needle in the right direction from two different perspectives.
Yeah. So what's the relationship, like mold, right? Mold and heavy metals. Would the presence of one kind of make the other much more, have more effects on somebody's fertility, or how does that work, like the interaction?
Yeah. So what we typically find is most people don't have just mold or just metals. They have a little bit of both, right? And so it becomes a little bit of like the chicken or the egg situation. And I would so there's kind of two ways this can go. First, mold is hepatotoxic, meaning that it impacts the liver and detoxification efforts in the liver. And so ultimately what that means is when detoxification gets slowed down in the liver, it means that everything that we come in contact with, heavy metals, chemicals, otherwise, then becomes more of a burden on the body because the liver simply can't do its job effectively to remove and eliminate them. So that's one way that we can see kind of mold come first and then heavy metals have issues after the fact because the liver's being burdened. But the other thing that we often see is that women will have a heavy metal burden and it makes them more susceptible when they do come in contact with mold to have what's called colonization. And then they have a candida overgrowth in the gut. And for those who don't know, colonization is essentially this concept that when we come in contact with mold is a fungus, it produces spores and we inhale those spores. That's the primary way that we come in contact with mold and it impacts our body outside of the mycotoxins that they produce, which are basically the poisonous substances. Those mold spores then go into the body and they can colonize the sinuses or the GI tract. So often we'll see women who have a candida overgrowth in their gut and they're doing candida work around that. Well, if we don't also assess and help with those heavy metal burdens, heavy metals are actually metabolized by candida in the gut. And so from that perspective, candida can be protective against heavy metals and essentially harbor them so that they aren't circulating. What we know about heavy metals is that when they are circulating, they cause a lot of damage and oxidative stress, and they're more susceptible to be sequestered in certain tissues in the body that are high in fatty acid content, like the brain, which is the last place where we want heavy metals to be. And so ultimately, the body has this innate wisdom to try and sequester them in the GI tract where the candida lives, but it becomes very tricky to get rid of the candida effectively if we don't also address the heavy metals first.
Yeah. How about parasites? I know that they are
Yeah.
also useful, right, when it comes to heavy metals. So essentially, are they kind of like the candida in your gut, like helping, like lower your heavy metal load in some ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I do think about parasites as protective. Keep in mind that parasites are reliant on us as their host to live, and everybody has parasites to some degree. They're there for a reason. They are our little hitchhikers, but they are also helping us in a lot of ways because if we are sick and unable to function, it means that they die too. And so that's not their goal. So a lot of people have symptoms from parasites. And I know that parasites have become very popular, I would say in the past couple of years, where people are very aware and being more open-minded about parasites and want to get rid of them. But what we also see is that people do a lot of parasite cleansing, a lot of parasite work, and they're just always there. And they're like, oh my gosh, I have such a huge infection of parasites. But the bigger question is, why are they there? Because parasites can hold 6 times their body weight in other toxins, and they thrive in terrains that are toxic. So there's been research done on fish that showed where fish were living in a polluted environment or polluted water, and they had huge parasitic overgrowth. And when scientists actually opened up the fish, they found that the tissues of the fish were not toxic. They didn't have any of those pollutants. But when they looked at the inside the bodies of the parasites, that's where all the pollutants were. And so parasites are working with us to make sure that these things aren't circulating in our body. So when we see a lot of parasitic infections, or we see, whether it's symptoms or we're seeing them in the toilet, why is it there? There's some type of toxicity that they are trying to protect us from. And of course, addressing them is part of the solution for healing and reducing inflammation and helping with gut health. But if we don't actually address why they're there in the first place, it just means that they're going to come back again and again.
Yeah. So basically, take care of the terrain first before trying to kill them off.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Because I know like so many people are now almost like so obsessed with it. Like I've tried everything. Now I'm going to try the parasite cleanse. And then they're like doing it for maybe years and they're still continuing to eliminate parasites. But then it's because they're not addressing the reason why the parasites are there. Now, so sometimes, because I also kind of don't love that, like, oh, let's kill first, right? Like, and then take care of the next one. But what if somebody has a very high, like very, very high parasite load, or like their candida overgrowth is very high? Would you start off with maybe doing one like cleanse to address it, to like help the body sort of be able to absorb what it needs to absorb?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I do think it needs to be part of the picture clinically, but it can't be the only piece. So kind of the way that we do things is we start with the foundations of things. So that means if somebody has vitamin or mineral deficiencies, we want to address those right away. Now, we do know that if they have things like heavy metals or parasites or other infections, that they're very likely not absorbing all of those things. But if we don't have a little bit in place and start working to replenish them, it makes the whole process a lot more challenging and usually a lot more uncomfortable. So we start there. And then we also start by addressing whatever that person's unique drainage issues are. So if their liver needs support, we'll start with liver support, whether that's bringing in bile supports, if we're thinking about more fatty acids, if we're using things like herbs to support more phase 2 detoxification in the liver. If we're thinking about the kidneys, how do the kidneys need support? Is it hydration? Do we need more minerals in place to help with that? Are they constipated in particular? So we know that things like parasites or candida can certainly contribute to constipation, but even if we can support symptom presentation by promoting motility to make sure that we're actually eliminating things before we get to that root cause of why they're constipated, that means that we're able to eliminate things a lot more effectively. This can also look like getting people sweaty, right? Sweat is a drainage pathway too. So having people take hot Epsom salt baths, get in a sauna, do things that like move their body and their skin as a detoxification pathway. And then from there, what we do is we decide what makes the most sense. So some people will start with doing some parasite work as we're working on the exposure sources for toxicity, and then coming back and doing some cleanup work. So the way that we typically like to do things is do parasite work and then move more into mold. Typically, parasite work and heavy metals can go hand in hand because there's some similar binders that work for the two of them. And then we kind of get to the real root cause of like the mold work and really digging deep there. But we do that last because people who are mold sick tend to be a little bit more sensitive. And so it just means that when we bring in things like antifungals, which might be part of addressing colonization, but they're going to be a little bit more sensitive to that. And so we want that to be the very final piece of their puzzle that is getting addressed to really kind of clean everything up there. But a lot of that work already has begun to happen, right? We're already working on drainage and the liver and the other areas that are innately part of detoxification of those type of toxins, in addition to having conversations with clients about where are these things coming from?
Yeah.
Is mold in your house? What type of water are you drinking? Where are these heavy metals coming from? So that they can start to work on reducing those exposures at the same time that we're working on detoxing them, so that we aren't essentially putting them on a hamster wheel where they're just chasing something without ever addressing where it's actually coming from.
Right. So you were talking about the sources of toxic exposures. What are the most common toxic exposures that we encounter on the daily?
Yeah, great question. So I would say tap water is one of the top ways that we get exposed to a lot of different things. Tap water, the way that it is purified in the US, is not as great as people think that it is. A lot of research shows that tap water contains things like heavy metals, radioactive substances. It also contains pharmaceutical drugs. So for instance, there's a lot of research that shows that there are things like NSAIDs or anti-inflammatories that are present in tap water, things like antidepressants, but also hormonal birth control. Those things aren't being filtered out of our tap water. And so especially when we're thinking about fertility, those things are going to play a big role. And so when we see a toxin burden that has a lot of heavy metals and a lot of chemicals, pesticides, things like that, we do want to think about food, of course, but we're also thinking about water source. So that's one of the first ways that we look. And we always recommend either reverse osmosis water or distillation, depending on what we find, with added minerals back in, of course. And then from there, we always want to look at air quality, particularly in the home. So a lot of research shows that most homes have mold in them, right? So depending on what comes back on mycotoxin testing, it can be really helpful to test the home. It's the only way to objectively know if there is not mold in your home or if there's not a dangerous mold in your home. Not all mold is dangerous, but we want to know exactly what you're being exposed to. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to actually heal and remove those things from the body. So thinking about air purification, if we don't have access to air purifiers in the home, opening windows, making sure that we have airflow, getting sunshine in the home, all those things can help with improving air quality, especially now that most of us do work from home and spend a lot of time at home. Even, if you go to an office every day and you come home, you're still spending the majority of your day at home while you're sleeping. And so air purification goes a long ways. And then we want to think about pesticide sources. So I like to think about food quality. As much as possible, eating organic or at a minimum, avoiding the dirty dozen when it comes to conventional farming standards so that we can be avoiding things like glyphosate and atrazine. These both have huge implications not only for fertility, but immune health, autoimmunity, liver health, gut health, all sorts of things. And so those are a really great way to start reducing toxin burden from a pesticide perspective. But those are kind of like our three pillars that we usually think about: water, air quality, and food quality. And then from there, you can certainly branch out, but that keeps it a little bit more simple in terms of like this is going to reduce the amount of toxins that you're exposed to in a very significant way.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great starts, definitely. Instead of like, oh, and then let's do all your personal care products and,
Yes,
and make it really
totally.
overwhelming.
Totally. It gets
Yeah.
so overwhelming to be like my makeup and my deodorant, my shampoo. And are those things that we should consider at some point in time? Maybe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think if you hit the big ones, you're getting the most bang for your buck
Yeah.
on making those changes rather than having a list of 20, 30, 100 different things to change, right? Just
Yeah.
three big things. And they can be some bigger investments, of course, but they're going to reduce as much as you possibly can by just doing those three.
Yeah. And it's definitely an investment. But then if you think about it, if you're suffering from secondary infertility and then you're thinking about doing IVF or IUI, it's more expensive compared to just investing in an air purifier and a water
Yep.
filter
Mhm.
and organic foods.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. It really is. And I think, one of the things that we talk about a lot is success rates on things. So, IUI and IVF are investments in the day
Yeah.
and they have varying success rates. So typically, most IUI procedures have between a 5 and 10% success rate per round. IVF has up to a 60% success rate, but most people who have gone through IVF can tell you that most people don't get pregnant on their first round. You're very lucky if that does happen. And so you're looking at multiple rounds. And of course, per round, there is a dollar amount
Yeah.
associated with it. And what we have found in doing things this way, where we're detoxing the body, our success rates are around 70%. So that's better than both of those. And yes, there is an investment, but it tends to be even more affordable than going either of those routes.
And isn't like those like IUI and IVF kind of also adding to the toxic load anyways?
Yeah, they definitely can be. IUI is a little bit IUI can be more simple. The biggest way that those type of procedures can add to burden on the body more than anything is they are using either medications or
Mhm.
hormones to artificially stimulate ovulation and conception and things like that. And so what happens when we have, let's say, a woman, even in an IUI situation, who already has a liver that's burdened and poor gut health? If we give her something like Clomid to help with ovulation, or give a man who has those same issues Clomid to help with testosterone levels, it means that the liver is going to have even more of a burden on it. So it can make things worse, even if the goal of conception is achieved.
Yeah, yeah. And do those fertility doctors ever tell them that they need to detox after they do those
No,
procedures?
no, almost
Yeah,
never. They
right.
is not even on their radar, unfortunately.
So are there any warning signs that you're like, like, oh, you're going to be like experiencing secondary infertility or hormonal problems? Like, are there any warning signs or symptoms to watch out for?
Yeah. So I definitely think that there are some things, and it's just going to depend woman to woman on what your body can tolerate, essentially. So I do think that postpartum anxiety and depression is a huge warning sign. There's a lot of research shows that mineral imbalances are related to postpartum anxiety and depression. So while conventionally we think about, of course, having a village and having a support system and using antidepressants when needed is an important piece of that, the deeper issue may be that there's a mineral imbalance happening that needs to be addressed. And that can be kind of a precursor to having issues with secondary infertility. I also think about fatigue and
Mhm.
what is commonly referred to as mom brain, right?
Yeah.
I think all moms know like mom brain is a very real thing. Your brain stops working sometimes. And is this one of those things that is normal or is it just common? And so, if there is a high level of fatigue, especially after you get past that newborn phase of like sleep is being impacted and things like that, if you are still fatigued and having a lot of cognitive issues, walking into rooms and not knowing why you went there, like losing things all the time, that can be a sign that minerals have been depleted and that you might have issues with secondary infertility. And then, lastly, I would be thinking about things that might indicate that your thyroid has been impacted. So, when we give birth, especially to the placenta, women experience the largest drop in hormones that they will experience at any point in their life, to include menopause, which means that your sex hormones basically go down to zero. And when that
Mhm.
happens, we know that hormones don't function in a bubble. So, when your sex hormones tank, it means that things like your thyroid can be impacted. And especially when this is paired with less sleep, more stress, especially for first-time moms. All of that can impact the thyroid, and what happens can be postpartum thyroiditis. So one of the things that I often recommend for women is 3 months postpartum having a full thyroid panel to look at their thyroid to see if there are any imbalances happening there. But some of the symptoms that women might be experiencing are things like weight gain. They might be having trouble losing baby weight in particular, especially if diet, lifestyle, exercise, all of those things have returned to normal, but they're still struggling with that. They might have cold hands or feet. They have new constipation or slowed motility. That brain fog, as I mentioned, can kind of be a sign of hypothyroidism as well. Those are the big ones that I think about. But if you're having those and those are especially new for you, that might be a sign that your thyroid has been impacted. And ultimately, we know how important the thyroid is when it comes to supporting metabolic capacity early in pregnancy. And if there isn't something if there's something that's being missed with the thyroid, it just can make it very difficult to not only conceive, but especially get past that first trimester.
Okay. So what does it, because not everyone knows. So what does a full thyroid panel looks like?
Great question. Yeah. So a full thyroid panel is more than your TSH to start with. So typically what's run is going to be your TSH. Your TSH is your thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is the hormone that your brain produces to communicate with the thyroid to say, make more or make less of thyroid hormones. Now, some doctors will also run at least one marker for T4, which is one form of thyroid hormones. Typically, it's the free form, which just means it's the unbound form that cells can use. But what a lot of even endocrinologists don't tell women is that T4 is the inactive form of thyroid hormones. T4 has to be converted into T3, and T3 is much more potent for the cells to actually be able to use it. So T3 is really what matters at the end of the day. We want to see how much T4 you're producing because that is kind of your base level of thyroid hormones that your body has access to if it gets converted. When I'm thinking about a full thyroid panel, I want to see TSH. I want to see both total as well as free forms of T4 as well as T3. And then I like to see both TPO and TGB antibodies. Those are essentially screening for autoimmunity. One of the things that can happen during pregnancy is your immune system downregulates during the first and the third trimesters to keep baby safe, right? We don't want your immune system to accidentally mistake your baby for something that is foreign that it attacks. And so our immune system naturally decreases levels. When that happens, it can just create some type of dysregulation in the immune system. And ultimately, you might have something that comes up as far as autoimmunity in the postpartum period as your immune system attempts to rebalance everything. So checking for those antibodies to make sure that they are not elevated can give you at least an indication of if you have something going on with your thyroid, whether it's low or high, whether it's an autoimmune picture or just a thyroid issue.
Okay. Yeah. Because a lot of times when you say, get a thyroid panel, and they're like, I did. It was just TSH, right?
Yep, not enough.
That's not the complete picture.
No, it's not. And I do understand TSH should, in a perfect world, be having an inverse relationship with T4 and your thyroid hormones. So ideally what happens is if your thyroid hormones are low, your TSH is elevated. And if the TSH is elevated, it's an indication that they need to look further and maybe consider things like thyroid hormone medications to help be supportive. But what we know clinically is that communication is not always working perfectly. And so sometimes there can be a disconnect where thyroid hormones are low, but TSH looks perfect. It might even look optimal. And so if we don't have the full picture of everything, we can very easily miss something in that clinical picture.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are the leading factors for secondary infertility?
Yeah. So I would really point back to the thyroid. I think the thyroid is a huge factor for secondary infertility. A lot of women who don't have hypothyroidism prior to pregnancy do have it postpartum. And so that's something that I always recommend screening. You can do that as soon as 3 months postpartum, but if you are trying and not able to conceive or you're experiencing miscarriages, looking at the thyroid can be incredibly helpful. From there, I really would look towards heavy metals. Heavy metals are the number one thing that we do see contributing to secondary infertility in particular. It's not always that there's a mold issue unless there's something new in terms of exposure sources. Typically when women can conceive the first time, unless there's a new issue, it's not a mold issue. It's more that the minerals have been depleted and those heavy metals are now causing a whole lot of problems.
Yeah, because they all of a sudden start accumulating, right? Because they're like almost a replacement part for the minerals that we gave away. to our babies.
Yep, absolutely. We give everything to our children, and sometimes it is to our own detriment.
Yeah, I heard that I think it was my mom who told me this, that most women, like every time after they have a baby, they would lose a tooth. Knock on wood, it hasn't happened to me yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's some crazy things that happen during pregnancy and postpartum because of it's a huge stress on a woman's body at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like they even say that pregnancy is a liver stress test, right? It's a stress test for your liver,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
So how about, are you seeing a lot of women who has like PCOS or I could never say that word. Is it
Yeah.
endometriosis?
Yeah.
Or like even if it's like, undiagnosed officially by a doctor, but they suspect that they have it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see a lot of women who have been diagnosed with, let's say, PCOS, or they're suspicious of it. And typically I would say with with PCOS, I see this for primary infertility, where women might have the signs of PCOS in terms of what they're experiencing, or they just have long, irregular cycles. And often, what we see actually is when you look at testing for hormones, they might not actually have elevated testosterone levels, which is kind of the key indicator when we think about PCOS. So, if that's not the case, it then becomes a question of why are their cycles long and irregular, right? And so ultimately what it comes down to is the ability to ovulate. And there's kind of a domino effect that happens for ovulation to occur. So the pituitary has to produce something called FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone, in order for a follicle or an egg to be developed and essentially picked as the egg for ovulation for that cycle. If that's not happening, it makes it very difficult for that egg to be selected. If the egg does not produce enough estrogen or estradiol, then we don't have the next piece of the domino, which is another feedback loop to the brain to produce luteinizing hormone. If luteinizing hormone does not surge, then it makes it very difficult for adequate progesterone to be released. And all four of these pieces have to happen in order for the next cycle to go well, right? So the thing about a woman's cycle is that it's codependent on each other. The first half is dependent on the second half prior to it, and the second half is dependent on that first half of the cycle. And so often when women are thinking about PCOS or have been diagnosed, it might not truly be PCOS, but it tells us that they're not ovulating at the end of the day. And so then we just need to figure out what piece of the puzzle is missing. Maybe it's the pituitary hormones aren't being communicated appropriately. Why is that happening? Right? Is there something like mold, which is neurotoxic, that's impacting the pituitary and its ability to communicate with the ovaries? Or is there something like a heavy metal burden that's maybe being sequestered in the brain that's impacting that communication? A lot of women, I would say, in those cases too, and this even goes for other circumstances outside of PCOS, is they maybe can get pregnant, but then they have low progesterone levels. And so we're thinking about things like a progesterone cream or supplement, or even things like chasteberry to help support progesterone output. Ideally, if ovulation is occurring, then we're able to produce adequate levels of progesterone. And if that's not happening, it just tells you that ovulation isn't quite as robust as it could be in order to sustain that. And so the thing to keep in mind with ovulation at the end of the day is that ovulation occurs in a woman's body that feels safe. If there is some lack of safety, whether it is some type of stress on the body, external or internal, it makes it very difficult for ovulation to occur. Our bodies are so incredibly smart, and they know how to keep us safe. That's their priority. And so when we're going to put an additional burden on a woman's body, which ultimately carrying a pregnancy is, because we're going to ask for more nutrients and all of these big hormonal changes, if that's unable to happen effectively, it means that its conception becomes even harder and ovulation won't occur. Ovulation is typically the first thing to go when a woman's body doesn't feel safe. So that's usually what I'm thinking about with PCOS. With endometriosis can be a little trickier because I think that it needs to be a dual approach, ultimately. There's a lot of functional support that can happen, and there can be some more conventional approaches that are very, very supportive, particularly when we think about removing the tissue growths that occur, whether it's in the uterus or in the abdomen, especially when we're thinking about pain relief. So we do have a lot of clients who have endometriosis, and we support them through doing excision surgery to remove those growths. But we also do a lot of work with those women who have lots of parasitic overgrowths and a lot of mold colonization in their body as well. So the thing that I typically think about with endometriosis is, yes, we're probably going to need to remove some of those tissues, but why are they growing there in the first place, or growing where they're not supposed to be? That makes it difficult to conceive, especially when those growths are occurring within the uterus, which makes implantation very, very challenging. So we want to address what's happening in the immune system, how the uterus might be growing tissue abnormally and contributing to a lot of the pain and like clotting and heavy bleeding that those women experience as well.
How does, like, what is the root cause, or like, how does endometriosis start? Like, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of it has to do with immune system dysregulation. And then I do think that there is a big toxin burden that happens. So some people believe that there can be parasitic issues primarily in the liver that are part of the root cause for endometriosis, particularly when we're thinking about liver flukes. But again, like, why are they there? Because the liver is probably toxic to begin with, and it's having trouble removing some of those toxin burdens. And I think ultimately, we're seeing a huge upswing in things like endometriosis in women now because of the huge toxin burden that we're all exposed to every day.
How about insulin resistance? Is that a factor for endo, or is it for PCOS, or for both?
It's a little bit more for PCOS, but I think it plays a factor for both, honestly. Blood sugar dysregulation impacts all hormones in the body, ultimately. And so it can make it very difficult to regulate sex hormones. You can downregulate sex hormones or upregulate adrenal hormones, and any type of imbalance is going to impact the ability to conceive. It can lengthen cycles out in the case of PCOS, but yeah, there's definitely a factor with blood sugar dysregulation when it comes to endometriosis as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate dance in there with our
Yeah,
hormones.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any favorite tools for nervous system regulation? Because, we obviously know that if you're very dysregulated, also your hormones are going to be very dysregulated.
Yep, absolutely. There's a number of things that I like. So I think it just depends on what makes the most sense for you, on if you want something that's like quick and acute, or if you want to put in some more time, especially if you
Mhm.
have like deep rooted nervous system dysregulation, then it can take a little bit more time. It's not a fast fix. Some of my more like quick fixes, I love Bach Flower Remedies Rescue Remedy. It's a homeopathic remedy that you can use. It's also safe for kids, so I love this one, for moms and kids in particular. It's something like 4 drops that you can use and you'll feel better very, very quickly, so I love that one. I also love ME Support from Cellcore. This one
Okay.
it's kind of like it has lavender in it, but I actually like this one to be used topically. So I usually have clients put it on the back of their neck, and then for kids, I'll have them put it on the bottom of their feet. It can be really helpful. Have you ever heard of a sonic slider?
No.
Okay. Well, a sonic slider is a tuning fork. It's a weighted
Okay.
tuning fork that you can hit on your hand and ring. And then I have on it essentially what is called a boot, but it makes it so that you can press it on your body. And so a sonic slider is tuned to Schumann's resonance, which is the resonance of the earth. So it's very grounding. So it's really great for bringing you back into a grounded space, especially when you're more acutely dysregulated. So I love that. I will usually put that like on my sternum, but I use that on my son all the time, on his feet and on his neck and all kinds of things. So I love that as well. And then in terms of like more long-term support, I do really love the Primal Trust program. They do a lot of education. There's a lot there, but they do a really great job of explaining like why the nervous system is just regulated, different phases that you can be in, and then actually providing tools for when that dysregulation comes up to do more brain retraining work to actually catch yourself in those moments where your brain is playing tricks on you so that you can rewire things and set a new tone.
You're the third person that has told me about Primal Trust.
They're amazing. They do
Yeah,
really
I've
good work.
I've been
I've gone
looking
through their
into it.
program personally.
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah. I've been looking into that. So I'm really gonna look deeply, because I feel like a lot of times when people come to us for healing and they're doing all the things, but then they feel like they're not getting anywhere. And I think it's because of their nervous system.
Oh yeah.
Okay, you need to work on that first, or even the mindset, right?
Mhm.
Like, sometimes I think that's the biggest barrier people have to healing, because they're so scared of like the big change. I think it's almost
Oh
like they're
yeah.
addicted. It's like secretly addicted to suffering.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there are a lot of things that can happen to us, whether it's toxins or infections or gut health or whatever it is. And those things inherently dysregulate our nervous system. And then we're in this dysregulated state and it's
Mhm.
hard to get out of that. So if we never
Yeah.
address that, we get stuck
Yeah.
ultimately. And, to your point, one of the big things that we talk to people about when we're working with people who have mold or they have Lyme or whatever it is you have this thing. This thing is not you. If
Yeah.
you are always saying, I'm sick with mold or I have Lyme or whatever it is like it can become your identity very quickly.
Yeah.
Or if you're struggling with infertility, of like, oh, I'm infertile. Like, what a terrible way to think about your
Yeah.
body. I know so many women who are struggling feel like their body is broken.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we're really trying to do is change that narrative to say your body is keeping you safe. It's a really crappy way to do it, but it is keeping you safe by all means necessary. And when your body is safe, then you're able to conceive. And so, even changing the way that we word things to ourselves,
Yeah.
our bodies are always listening. So, we try to encourage women who are trying to conceive not to say trying to conceive, because trying to conceive
Mm.
implies that it might not work, right?
Okay.
Where
Yeah.
if we say, I'm open to conception, there's no negative connotation there. It's an entirely different experience in your body that says, this could happen. This is safe. This is not like a maybe it'll happen, maybe it
Yeah.
won't.
Yeah. It's not like an added pressure or stress to your
Right.
cells and your body. So do you find yourself like doing like the mindset work and the nervous system regulation work kind of towards the beginning of when you work with your clients, or where do you like
Yeah.
ingest
Yeah,
the,
I think
infuse it in?
I think it's different for everybody. So, I will say it's not uncommon for the women that we work with in particular. They have a certain personality type, right? These
Okay.
are
Yeah.
type A, perfectionist, like to control everything people. And when you're trying to conceive and it's not happening, oh man, that is tough, right? It's really hard to understand that you are not in control in those
Yeah.
situations. And so when those women come in, it's something that we start with on day one in terms of the
Okay.
mindset and nervous system component of things. Or if somebody has a very stressful job, it's something we always want to address because we got to get that piece of the puzzle figured out. And then for some women, they are at least calm on the outside, and it's something that we bring up at some point in the course of working together, because I do agree with you, it's very important and something everybody should be thinking about. But for some people, the time of introduction of that really just does vary. But I would say more and more it is something we're thinking about on day one. What are the things we can do? What are like the limiting beliefs that women
Yeah.
have around their health? And how do we start to change that narrative so that it empowers them to notice when those things are coming up? Because we can't be with our clients day in and day out, right? We get a very
Yeah.
limited amount of time with them, and we want to try and plant seeds with them that will help them 24/7, not just the time that we have with them.
Yeah. If only we can put a headpiece in their ear, and when we hear them say something negative, you're like, Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah.
So we already spoke about the leading factors for secondary infertility. So what are ways or that we resolve this? And let's start with that. I'm not gonna make the question a double question. What are
No
ways
worries.
that you
Yeah. So, I think when we're thinking about hypothyroidism, I want to know, is this a mineral issue? Because keep in mind that the thyroid is reliant on four things: iodine, selenium, magnesium, and zinc. All of those are minerals at the end of the day. And so, if there are low in any one of those areas, that's an easy way to support actual production of thyroid hormones. I also want to know if there's conversion issues. So, if somebody has a lot of T4, but their T3 is low, great, we're just
Mhm.
not converting. That happens primarily in the liver and in the intestines. So, that means those are the areas that we want to look to. Is their liver functioning appropriately? Do they have gut health issues or imbalances that need to be addressed? I also want to know if they have any type of autoimmunity. So, if they do, then I'm looking at the immune system. Again, that's going to be looking at the gut and any other type of infections there. But that's where I think for hypothyroidism, I kind of want to see the full picture so I can figure out what type of support is indicated. And then when we're thinking about heavy metals, I'm definitely thinking about replenishing minerals that are lost. So first step there is knowing what their unique mineral profile looks like. So this can be done either via blood work or HTMA to look at what mineral levels look like, where they are low, and what actual supports they need. So we try not to guess as much as
Yeah.
possible. So it might mean that somebody only needs something like magnesium, but maybe they need calcium, magnesium, and sodium. We want to know what that looks like so that they can be supported appropriately. And then we want to know also what type of heavy metals they have. They all function differently and displace different things in the body. So if they have a heavy metal that displaces magnesium, it means they're going to need a lot of magnesium to be supportive of that while we work on that. But if they have a heavy metal that doesn't displace magnesium, they probably just need a normal amount of magnesium. So we want to know what they have, and then that also helps with selecting binders to help pull out and eliminate heavy metals. So all heavy metals, and the same is true for mycotoxins from mold, they are not all bound by the same things. So binders are essentially some type of agent that goes into the body and grabs onto heavy metals or mycotoxins and helps, transport them out via the bowels. So if you have something like lead, well, lead has very specific binders that are effective compared to something like aluminum. We don't want to be picking the wrong binders. And so ultimately what testing for heavy metals does helps us make a very effective and comprehensive protocol that is what somebody needs versus giving them something like a heavy metal binder that is general.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most common ways I see this done is where people will use something like a zeolite for heavy metals and say, like, this is a heavy metal binder. Absolutely it is, but it doesn't bind to all heavy metals. And so knowing exactly what you have and working with a practitioner who understands what binders work and which don't can make a huge difference there.
Yeah, definitely. And I know there's a lot of issues with zeolite too, and it's very highly recommended right now. I'm losing my train. I was going to ask you, do you see a lot of women, like, in your practice, right? Their secondary infertility. Is it common to find copper toxicity in those cases?
Yeah, you can definitely see some copper toxicity sometimes. It's not super common, but it does happen every once in a while. I think part of the copper toxicity picture for women has to do with using copper IUDs, for instance. So I know that because many women are being mindful of what they're putting in their body and they don't want to be doing hormonal birth control, a copper IUD feels like a perfect fit, right?
Yeah.
But it can contribute to copper toxicity. And then that imbalances things like zinc and iron and just messes with everything. So we do see that a lot, especially, I would say we probably see that more for secondary infertility in particular, where women have a baby, want to have some type of contraception method, but don't want to do hormonal birth control. And then, they have it removed and they're like, why can't I get pregnant? I have these really heavy periods. What's happening here? That's copper toxicity in action.
Yeah.
Outside of that, it's fairly rare to see. It can sometimes happen in a primary infertility case, but it's a lot more common, I would say, in secondary.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's go to IVF. What are the risks involved with IVF?
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of risk involved with IVF. So from my perspective in the detoxification space is first and foremost that when you can't get pregnant and the baby is you're unable to conceive, your body is unsafe, it means that there is likely a toxin burden. And when we force the body to conceive, which is often successful, it means that toxin burden gets transferred. And so you end up in a situation like mine where you have children who then have toxin burden. Right. And then you have to address it from that perspective in children, which tends to be a little bit more severe and acute. So I don't have any health issues with the toxin burden that I have. My son had full body, very angry eczema, right?
Yeah.
And lots of digestive issues. So that can be one thing that happens. There's also a lot of risks for children who are born via IVF. So there's a lot of blood sugar dysregulation and insulin resistance issues that happen. Children with IVF are more likely to have those issues, but also have obesity or more fat adipose tissue on their body as a result of IVF. And we also know that because of a lot of the things that are being provided to mom during the process, that there's a higher liver burden. That in turn gives children higher liver burdens as well and more inability to detoxify effectively. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that unfortunately aren't shared from an informed consent perspective when couples are going through the IVF process, more than anything so that they understand the full scope of things and can make a decision based on that. It doesn't mean don't do it by any means. It's probably still going to be a great fit for many couples. But I think if they have that information, it would allow them to know that first and foremost, so there's no surprises. But I think it also then gives them the ability to be on the lookout for those things in their children in the future, rather than have these things come from what feels like left field, that their children now have these health issues that they're trying to deal with after the fact, where they can kind of be on the lookout and catch those things on day one to support their children.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very I didn't even know that. I mean, I've never been through that journey, but I can imagine the couples not getting told, informed of the consequences or what would possibly happen to their children. And yeah, I can imagine the toxic burden. So, would you recommend, let's say, someone did go through IVF and then now their child has eczema and whatnot? Would you recommend testing, if they come to you, like testing both the mom and the child, or do you just work with the child? Like, what would be your plan of action for that?
Yeah, so we do work with children typically. We have like a whole pediatric practice that has evolved as a result of working with my son and sharing his story. So what we typically do is we just test the child, because ultimately there's no guarantee that everything from mom transfers to baby, just because of genetics and the way that children are very different than their parents in a lot of ways.
Okay, yeah.
And we're ultimately blending genes, right? And so there's no guarantee that it's going to be one for one. But we do test toxin burden for children typically, and we also do a stool test. That
Okay.
usually gives us the most comprehensive look at what their toxin burden is, how it's impacting their gut, and then evolving into things like digestive issues, whether it's colic or stomach pain, things like bedwetting, constipation, or even eczema.
Yeah. Constipation to right now, I feel like is kind of big. It seems like
Oh, yeah.
so many kids are so constipated, and a lot of doctors obviously will just recommend Miralax
Yeah.
or, and then but a lot why is it also just a toxic burden, like with like these little kids
Yeah.
constipation?
Yeah, it can be. So typically, when I see a child who's constipated, I will ask mom, "Do you also experience constipation?" And she says, "Yeah,
Mm,
I've been constipated like my whole life." And it's like, okay,
okay.
there's a gut issue, right? So that's a microbiome transfer that happens both in utero as well as via birth. More and more children are being born via C-section, which means that they are not getting a lot of that microbiome transfer that happens via the vaginal canal during birth. So that's one factor. But we also know that when children are born via C-section, that mom at a minimum is being exposed to antibiotics. So if she is
Yeah.
breastfeeding, those things are being transferred. So we know that the gut microbiome can be disrupted. So that can be a huge factor when it comes to constipation. But the other thing, so if mom says, nope, I don't have any constipation or I don't have any health issues, children are often the canary in the coal mine. They have very small bodies. And so they become toxic a lot faster than adults do. So it's not uncommon for us to see children who have really bad eczema or really bad constipation. And when we do toxin testing on them, we find a lot of mold. And
Okay.
when the parents test the home, we find dangerous mold in the home that's impacting the child, but nobody else has any symptoms.
Yeah.
And it's just because they accumulate so much faster because they're smaller than us. It takes far less to make them sick than it does adults. And so they're kind of like the first warning sign that there could be some type of
Okay.
toxin burden when we see those things happening. But it can contribute to things like constipation. So, one of the things that we know with mold is that mold impacts the motility system, and it will slow down motility as part of mold's mean way of making sure that it can survive in the body as long as possible. And so it slows down elimination so it has a chance to colonize and grow and cause
Mm,
more issues. And so we'll see children who have really bad constipation where they're going maybe like once a week, once every 2 to 3 weeks with a bowel movement, which
yeah.
means that they're not only not removing things like mold, but everything they come in contact with as far as toxin burden. The hormones that they're producing are not being eliminated effectively. And it needs to be on a daily basis. Otherwise, those things are just accumulating and building up even further.
Yeah. So would sweating, like, I know sometimes it takes a while to resolve the constipation, even if
Mhm.
they remove the gluten and the dairy and all that stuff, right? Would sweating every day kind of help, kind of speed up, like, the process while you're doing all the other things to help with
Oh, yeah.
constipation?
Yeah, absolutely. Sweating's great. And I think, there's this is always like a multifaceted thing. I think with children, a lot of children aren't moving their bodies the way that they should
Mm-hmm.
be, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of screen time that's involved in our modern culture. And so children who move their bodies are not only moving their organ systems, but they're moving their lymphatic systems. They're getting sweaty, even if they're not dripping in sweat. Like children
Yeah.
barely get sweaty when they like run around like little wild Indians. It's not a thing. So that can be helpful, but we also usually recommend detox baths. So you can give a
Okay.
kid a warm bath with something like bentonite clay or opening something like activated charcoal into the bath. I usually call it something like a mud bath, like make it something fun for the kids of like why they are sitting in dirt water at this point.
Yeah.
And that helps ultimately pull things through the skin in addition to like physically warming up the temperature of their body to stimulate sweating, very similar to how like an Epsom salt bath does the same thing. So that can be another
Okay.
way if they're less inclined to move their body or they don't get sweaty easily, like bathing children in those type of detox baths can go a long way to help start moving the needle and reducing that toxin burden while you work on some of that deeper issues.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Now, before we close this up, tell us a little bit about your book. Why did you write it? And what's like your favorite part or maybe a favorite takeaway that someone can get from your book?
So my book, Toxic Infertility, I wrote because I I do a lot of mentoring with other practitioners, and I for years now have had people say, where do I learn more about these connections with toxins, and where do I figure out how it's impacting other parts of the body? And nothing like this existed. And so I wanted this to be a resource not only for women who are struggling with infertility to actually get a lot of information about the systems in their body that are negatively impacting fertility, but also the root cause of those and things that they can change in their home from a toxin perspective. But I also wanted it to be a really like a teachable resource.
Okay.
I am very big on education, and I love having educated clients that understand why their recommendations are there, what they're impacting, so that they are then empowered to make more of those decisions long after we stop working together. And so I wanted to create a resource that was very comprehensive to help people know what's happening. And a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from people is this would be great for everybody, regardless of whether you're struggling with infertility or not, because we talk about gut health and thyroid and liver and mitochondria and key nutrient depletions. And then we turn it back around and say, these are the ways that you can change personal care items. These is like how you change your cooking, your cleaning items, why water quality matters, why air matters, all of those things. It's a heavily research-backed book. There is a ton of citations for anybody who wants to go dig further into the research as well, because I know a lot of clients in particular really do love going down those rabbit holes of like, what is actually happening here?
Yeah.
In terms of like what I really love about the book, I think there's not enough talk about mitochondria and their importance in fertility. For, just for a frame of reference, most cells in the body have between 1 and 10,000 mitochondria per cell. Female eggs have 100,000
Wow.
mitochondria per cell. It's a lot. And so when mitochondria are impacted, we know that egg quality and egg health significantly goes down. And the number one thing, because mitochondria are these very small parts of our cells that impacts them, is going to be toxins. They're the first thing that gets impacted. And so when we think about the ability to change egg quality and egg count, especially because so many women feel like their biological clock is ticking, they're after 35, they're like, I want to have more children. There's so much that can be done from a mitochondria perspective that challenges the conventional narrative of you get what you get with eggs.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, we see women that can still have babies even in their face, right? So it really
Yep.
just depends on how your body is working.
Yep, absolutely. We've seen clients get pregnant as late as 42 after struggling with infertility. So it can certainly be done.
Yeah. Yeah. It's never too late, right?
No.
All right. I always close out with sharing a favorite mantra or a golden nugget to help inspire or, like anyone in a healing journey or, struggling with infertility and all that stuff.
I feel like the first thing that comes to mind for me, regardless of where you're at, is that your body is not broken. I think the more that you can really lean into that and believe it, whether you're having trouble getting pregnant, if there's something going wrong, if you have autoimmunity, if you have mold illness, if you have these symptoms that are mysterious and nobody can figure out, it's very easy to feel like it's always going to be that way and that there's just something wrong with you. I don't think there's anything wrong with anybody. I think that everybody who has a health issue, their body is having an appropriate response to essentially being poisoned. And the more that we can actually understand that and wrap our heads around it, it means that anything is possible, because I think that the body has this very innate ability to heal if we just give it the tools to do that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Deidre, for joining me today. And if you're still listening, thank you for listening, and stay rebellious.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please click the subscribe button, share it with others, post about it in social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me or suggest topics, you can follow me on Instagram at Fatima Pagtakan or at The Wellness Rebel Show. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.